Hello, my name is Uma. In today's video, I'll be talking about some under-the-radar skills that I think every developer should learn. These are a curation of skills that aren't being talked about as much or at all, but are very important for every developer to have. Without further delay, let's jump into it. Links to all the resources I will mention and the timestamp for the entire video are down in the description, so feel free to check them out and skip to any section you want. The first skill is learning to use the terminal. If you are starting to be a developer or if you're already a developer, I'm sure you'll agree with me that at some point, you will have to use a terminal. If you don't know what a terminal is, I plan on making a full video about it and some of the most useful commands for developers. That video will be linked above in the cards and in the description below when it's out. Quick summary. The terminal is basically another way to interact with the computer without using the graphic user interface. You type in the command to do things that you would otherwise use a mouse to do. Every operating system has some form of a terminal, and there are entire operating systems where the terminal is the only way you can interact with the system. Most Linux virtual machines are like this, and most of the code we build ends up on machines like this. You may be in a situation where you have to SSH into one of those machines to run commands and see what's happening with something you've deployed, or you may be giving one of those systems as your primary dev machine. When that time comes, you should at least know the basics. How to get into a folder, how to copy files from one folder to another one, delete files, and edit files using one of the text editors, probably Vim or Nano. There is also shell scripting, which is a different topic that I'll go into in another video. Developers also like using the terminal because it's somewhat easier and takes up way less time, for me at least. Except debugging, most things an IDE can do can also be done in the terminal, but with the added advantage of being faster and not having to install additional software. Every GitHub command can be run on the terminal. You can write and compile entire programs for multiple languages from the terminal alone. At the end of the day, whatever packages or modules you need to install for some languages will most likely be done from the terminal as well. So one way or another, you've either used a terminal or you're going to use one. So it's best to know the basic commands. The best way to do this is to practice. Some commands you use in the terminal will also be helpful when creating pipelines to test and deploy your code. This leads to the second skill: DevOps and deploying your code. Before you get a job where the code you write is in production, most of your code ends up on your local machine or GitHub. You run it locally, it works, and that's the end of the project. Now, that's just one part of the equation. The other part is building and deploying your code to an environment where people can interact with what you've built. It may involve using technologies like Docker, Ansible, or something else. Deploying your code comes with learning environment variables and how to secure them, expose them, and use them in your code. It involves creating pipelines, a series of steps to get your code from your local machine to the server where it will be running. You have to write those steps and stages, follow the proper syntax, and put them in a file where the platform you're using can read them. It also comes with securing the application and setting up performance analytics and logging. So if there's a problem, you can easily pinpoint where the problem is coming from. A lot of this comes with experience, but it's also something you can practice on your own. Next time, try deploying your finished project. You may learn a thing or two. The next skill is testing. A day will come where you will have to create tests to test your code or an app you built. Continuous integration and continuous development are industry standards now. As new code is added to a repository, that code has to be tested to make sure it does not have bugs or introduce new bugs to the existing system. Whatever framework you're learning or developing in, learn testing within that framework and write tests to test your code. Java has JUnit test, React has Jest, Enzyme, Cypress, and a few more. Python has PyTest, UniTest, Nose2, and a few more as well. Every language or framework has a testing library associated with it. Learn it as you learn to code. There are other testing frameworks used to test the system's behavior from an outsider's perspective, like Cucumber. It's a pretty good one that you should probably learn. I will suggest you study testing similar to how you would learn a new language. Learn about code coverage, what makes a good test case, flaky test cases, and all of that. Majority of the code we write may work, but they are not necessarily testable. Writing test cases will teach you a lot about writing code that is testable, which is a good feature for your code to have. The final skill is about paying attention to detail. This is one that I've known about for a while, but I've been recently reminded to pay more attention to. When you're writing code for a project, there are two ways you can go about it. This is the first way. You're writing the code for the project and you're at a point where you come across a problem or a bug or a feature that you don't know how to implement. So you go online, Google your question, and find answers. You copy code snippets that solve your problem from places like Stack Overflow, GitHub repositories, or documentation. Eventually, you put something together that works. The project is done. All good. Nothing wrong with that. The second way is to do the same thing, but while copying those snippets of code for parts you don't know, you read the snippets to understand what's happening in the code, read the explanation that comes with the snippets, and do some more research into the topic. I'll give you an example. I made a whole video series about making a web application that transfers music from Spotify to Apple Music. Part of the process was to authenticate with both Spotify and Apple Music. For that, you needed to create a separate server whose sole purpose was authentication. The code for that server is widely available online. Multiple people have done it and I was not about to reinvent the wheel, so I found a repo that has it, copied the parts I needed, understood how it worked, and called it a day. I was recently in a job interview where I was asked a question about authentication. I was asked what is the difference between authentication and authorization. In the back of my head, I knew what it was because of my experience with that project. I had seen those words before in the code snippets and in the documentation, but I couldn't answer the question because I didn't do as much research into that topic as I should have while I was working on that project. That part of the project was my chance to learn about authentication and authorization, but I didn't pay attention. The interviewer eventually gave me the answer, and as I assumed, the code I copied did both authentication and authorization. I just didn't bother to dig into it and understand those concepts. When you find that Stack Overflow answer that gives a code snippet to your question, do you just copy the code snippet, paste it, and call it a day? Or do you go back and read the explanation as to why it works so you understand it better? A lot of answers come with explanations. Read them. When going through documentation, do you read the documentation or do you just copy the code snippets from it and move forward? At a specific point in your career and for some companies, knowing how to code isn't enough. There are thousands of people who can code, and learning a new language gets easier the more you code. People can also learn to solve leak code questions to get past technical interviews. What will set you apart is knowing answers to questions about why something works a specific way and knowing key details that the average person doesn't. The best way to learn this is to read more and do more research into concepts and topics that are new to you as you code. That's all I have for you in this video. If you have any under-the-radar skills that you've developed over time or a skill that's not been talked about enough, feel free to leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Peace.